From this point on, we will refer to something called the Western diet. So, what exactly is the Western diet? Well, according to Wikipedia, the Western Pattern Diet, or WPD, or the Standard American Diet, also known as SAD, is a modern dietary pattern that is generally characterised by high intakes of red meat, processed meat, pre-packaged foods, butter, candy and sweets, fried foods, high-fat dairy products, eggs, refined grains, potatoes, corn and high fructose corn syrup, and high sugar drinks. The modern American standard diet was brought about by fundamental lifestyle changes following the Neolithic Revolution and later the Industrial Revolution. So, as we can see, the Western diet is seen as American diet, but it should be made clear that the influence of the American diet has now, thanks to globalization, been adopted in countries all over the world. Burger and fries, anyone? It should also be noted that events that take place in the US with regards to food production also have implications for other food producing and consuming countries. So let's move on now to the second event in the history of nutrition. The first was the Agricultural Revolution. The second occurred much more recently.
In 1977, the United States Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs published the results of an investigation into improving American health, headed by Senator George McGovern. The McGovern Report, as this piece eventually was called, told millions of Americans they could eliminate most of their health problems by utilising and adopting a low-fat diet. Thus began the era of the low-fat fad diet and the worst government-sponsored health crisis in the world. The US Department of Agriculture, whose interests are to look after the interests of farmers, along with the agency that is now called Health and Human Services, first released a set of national dietary guidelines back in 1980. That 20-page booklet trained its focus primarily on three health villains: fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. But there was one problem. These guidelines were completely wrong. A retrospective look back at the science behind these guidelines has been proven to be unsupporting and in some instances deliberately misleading. An international team of health scientists completed a systematic study of the evidence back in the 70s and 80s and concluded that the relationship of causation between fat consumption and coronary heart disease was never established. Overseas, national health authorities followed America's lead on low fat. In the UK, a non-profit called the National Obesity Forum, the NOF, published a blistering condemnation of its government's diet and nutrition policies. In its report, the NOF argues that advice to cut back on fat and cholesterol was the root cause of Britain's skyrocketing rates of obesity and diabetes. Speaking shortly after the report's publication, a British cardiologist who consulted on the NOF report said, "The change in dietary advice to promote low-fat foods is perhaps the biggest mistake in modern medical history." So, what's the big deal? The evidence points to no difference between a low-fat and a regular fat diet. Well, the decision to advocate low-fat diets simply meant that the fat component of the foods we ate would be replaced with carbohydrates in the form of added sugars and other heavily processed alternatives to fats. If you remember, in the earlier part of the course we discussed the relative scarcity of carbohydrates and the labour involved in gathering and processing them. Today we have a case of overconsumption of carbohydrates, especially in the form of added sugars, and less overall energy expenditure. So it didn't take long after the guidelines of the McGovern report were published and implemented to see the rise of obesity levels. They increased drastically to the levels they are today. It is estimated that around 40% of Americans are considered obese and 18% are considered severely obese as of 2019. This obesity rate has now been classed as a threat to national security due to the exponential costs of healthcare for obesity-related medical conditions.
During the last 50+ years, our grain-based diets have continued to rely on increasing volumes of processed and refined carbohydrate sources, including catastrophic amounts of sugar in the form of high fructose corn syrup and other sugar substitutes. If supermarkets removed products that had added sugars, they would need to take away 70 to 80% of their goods. Aside from the problems heavily processed foods cause us as individuals, they are also having an impact on the planet. According to some sources, half of the topsoil of the planet has been lost in the last 150 years. In addition to the erosion, soil quality is affected by other aspects of agriculture. These impacts include compaction, loss of soil structure, nutrient degradation, and soil salinity. Many of the crops we now grow in immense quantities can actually increase soil erosion beyond the soil's ability to maintain itself. If that wasn't bad enough, the quality of our soil has degraded so much due to the modern farming techniques that the quality of our most important food sources, earth-grown products, are often less nutritious than they once were. Some studies have shown that modern fruit and vegetables are between 15 and 40% less nutritious. This can be accounted for by the selection of cultivated varieties and the use of modern farming techniques, also the use of pesticides.